Mark Twain, the man. How does a man become a legend? The legendary man is the one whose personality stamps its mark indelibly on the minds of his own generation and generations that follow him. Great warriors, statesmen, explorers, inventors, scientists, visionaries, artists, men who in some way alter the world by their work or deeds become legends. Sometimes a man has such a dazzling personality that a whole body of anecdotes are attached to his name. He lives on as a legend in the minds of other men. Of all the men in the history of American literature, Mark Twain remains the best known and the best loved, both as a man and as a writer. He has become a living legend, a legendary personality, and a legend as a writer. First of all, he had striking, memorable appearance. His huge head of auburn hair, reddish brown, his big curling auburn mustache, and his bright dancing eyes caught the public's imagination. His conversation from early indolence impressed everyone, particularly his slow, drawling accent, what his mother called Sammy's long talk. When he was older, his hair turned completely white, and Mark Twain emphasized his picturesque white walrus mustache and his lion-like mane of his white hair by dressing in white suits. It is little wonder that he commanded attention wherever he went. People who came to see him out of curiosity, however, stayed to respect his wit and humor, for he was a superb talker. Early in life, he had learned how to tell a good story, first as a pilot on the Mississippi, later as a miner around the campfires of the West. He was a part of the storytelling tradition that the pioneers perfected. People always remarked over his fabulous fund of stories. They remembered how he roamed about as he talked, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice charming everyone with his soft Missouri accent. Often at dinner parties in his own home, he would get up between courses and stroll up and down, discussing and discoursing, while the guests paused over their food, fascinated by his wit, his wisdom, and his epigrams. His was a personality that always attracted people. He seemed to have been born with limitless amount of charm. He had come in with the appearance of Halley's comet in 1835, and in later years he used to tease his biographer and friends by remarking that anyone who came in with a comet was destined from the start to make a name for himself. He used to say that since he had come in with the comet, he would go out with it, and he did. As he lay dying, Halley's comet once more flashed across the sky. That the heavens seemed to conspire with his own flamboyance does not seem far-fetched. He was always in the thick of excitement. He was always where new things were happening, where people were trying to create a new kind of world. He was forever the spectacular personality doing unusual or outrageous things. Secondly, more than anyone man in his century, Mark Twain came to symbolize an era. He had done all the things that made the 19th century exciting and vital. He had been born at the gateway to the frontier, in almost the center of a nation that was just beginning to come into its own. He had grown up on the banks of America's greatest river. He had been a pilot on its treacherous waters. He had worked he had worked for little village newspapers whose humors and insights formed the image of the West. He had prospected for silver. He wrote books that extolled the life of the new West, that praised the pioneers and their children who were making a new nation in space and in spirit. He had gone across the Pacific and across the Atlantic to see with the eyes of a frontiersman worlds that were unlike his own. He had written of America as no other writer before or after him, putting the essence of the American spirit into his books and the excitement of the American dream into his characters. In many ways, he carried with him the legacy of new life that people like Judge and Jenny Clemens had gone to find. His father represented the gentle aristocracy of a settled part of the nation, Virginia. His mother had that vital spark of life that frontier families needed in order to survive. Sam Clemens was both his mother's and father's child. From his mother, he got much of his charm, his peculiar way of speaking, his forthright attitude toward life, his hard tread, his hatred of injustice and cruelty, his love of life itself. From his father, he inherited the grit and determination to make the most of his life, to uphold the honor and the values of an enlightened man. Sam Clemens grew up in the house where the love of intangible values, honoring one's word, meeting one's debts, standing by one's vows, was strong. The Clemens household was built on dual code of fighting against wrong and fighting for right. Hannibal, Missouri, the town in which he grew up, opened on the great expanse of the West. By its main street, the mightiest river in America flowed, a river thronged with endless legends of man and deeds. The boys of Hannibal were familiar with the strong acts of courage of the pioneers. They knew all the folk tales of the fabulous men who had opened up the West. Their whole lives were colored by a respect and admiration for the brave, strong, courageous men who stood against all odds for the things in which he believed. Mark Twain loved the surrounding countryside with its big cottonwood trees, its meandering creeks, its simple pleasures. He was always alert to the mysteries and beauties of nature, but he was aware too of the violence that lurked behind the peaceful exterior. Mark never forgot the two boys who had run drowned. He never forgot the tramp who was burned alive in the town jail. He never forgot the corpse lying in the moonlight on the floor of his father's office. He had loved the chorus farm, and he remembered the slaves there who had taught him so much. He carried with him the sound of Sandy's singing in his own house. He remembered the slaves who were sold down river. He kept vivid in his mind the brutality he had once witnessed against the slave. Slavery for a boy growing up in the South was a source of dual emotions. Young Sam Clemens played with little Negro boys. He felt a companionship with the Negro man that he did not feel with his own father. He knew and loved, respected many slaves, and as he grew older, the evil of slavery was always in his mind. He came to see it as a blot on the national integrity, an evil which would not simply be undone by the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, know the evil of slavery would be with the new nation for a long time to come. The slaves taught the young boy much. He heard stories that no white man ever told, for the slaves had a treasury of stories all their own. He listened to their superstitions and fears, and he absorbed their feelings about religion, about all. He loved the Negro spirituals, which became so deeply a part of his life. It was the music of the river, his river, the Mississippi. Wherever he went, Mark Twain carried Hannibal, the Qualls farm, and the river with him. Now they are forever imprinted in his books, a part of literary life. When Horace Bixby taught his young cub to know the shape of the Mississippi River, he was also teaching him how to impress on his mind details, the small things that reveal so much about the large one. Mark Twain's books were immeasurably enriched by this training. When he had to use all his mental resources to learn the Mississippi, he was developing his powers of observations to a high pitch. Ever after this would be invaluable to him as an artist. His life on Mississippi did much to form his thinking. During his days as a pilot on the mighty river, he evolved his philosophy of life. He wrote in his notebook, "Take it, inverted comma, life, full stop, just as though it was as it is an earnest, vital, and important affair. Take it as though the world had waited for your coming. Take it as though it was a grand opportunity to do and achieve." He followed that youthful advice to himself all his life. His outlook was one of the optimistic. True, there were terrible moments of doubt. The deaths of Henry, his brother Langdon, his son Susie, and Jean, his daughters, Livy, his wife, which made him question the workings and meanings of life. But he never for long gave up hope that a better world was around the corner. Even in the depths of despair. His humor never deserted him. With the outbreak of the Civil War, he was to leave the river and take part in one of the worst experiences of a man's life. Although Mark Twain did not serve longer than a few weeks, he remained until the end of his life, struck with the horror of the one death for which he held himself at least partially responsible. I would have given anything then my own life freely. He wrote of the stranger he and the others killed to make him again what he had been 5 minutes before the taking of that unoffending life seemed such a wanton thing, and it seemed an epitome of war, that all war must be just that, the killing of stranger again, whom you feel no personal animosity. Sickened by that unnecessary killing, he left the Confederate militia. It is little wonder he headed west. The violent energy of America was in him, and there was no other real choice for him but to move west to join the men who had gone out to Nevada to see their fortunes in silver. He went by stagecoach. He saw the Pony Express. He lived and worked in the silver mines. He was seeing America in the making. It was the uncommon man who went west, the man who was not afraid to face the unknown, the man who was looking for something in the new areas that he had not found in the settled ones. Many of these men were not quite sure what they were looking for, but it was basically for a new way of life. In part, of course, there was the promise of riches, gold or silver or land, but it was much more than material riches that those men sought. The people in the wagon trains and the prospector had a vision of a new community where a man would be judged by his own qualities and not by birth or wealth or social position. Mark Twain proved that the dream of the West was possible. He was a poor boy from a backwoods community who rose to the top of his profession. His talent and his will power took him to that high place, not influence or contacts or inheritance. No matter what the adventure on which he embarked, Mark Twain was always conscious of the power of the pen. Even happy as he had been on the river in his pilot days, he wrote. In the mining period, he wrote sketches and sent them to the Territorial Enterprise. He had printing ink in his veins. It is little wonder that in the end he came to his real calling, that of the writer. He remained the restless Westerner. Even when he was writing, he traveled to San Francisco and met other writers, important writers like Bret Harty, the author of The Luck of Roaring Camp, and many other famous stories of the West. Artemus Ward, author of humorous column called Artemus Ward's Sayings, which use misspellings, odd situation, and the unusual Western attitude to achieve its humor, and Charles Warren Stoddard and Orpheus C. Kerr. These men talked with Mark Twain. They met and discussed their problems in writing. They helped each other establish the new literature that was growing up around Western life. Mark Twain went to the Hawaiian Islands and tramped everywhere, seeing things at first hand and jotting down his vivid impressions. The celebrated jumping frog had given him his first taste of national acclaim. His account of the sinking of the Hornet and the terrible hardships of survivors was published across the country and greatly increased his name. Sammy's long talk had always impressed everyone, and it was natural that he should eventually turn to lecturing as one more field to conquer. He was splendid lecturer, holding his audience spellbound. He had a way of posing to emphasize keywords, of lazily building up to his point. Seemingly he was taking his time, but in reality he was piling climax upon climax until at last he brought the house down with a laugh that rolled over the stage in a great crescendo. His was a Western style of telling an anecdote. Through every one of his absurd exaggeration, he kept a poker face with all his wild tales and uproariously funny lines. He never betrayed any emotion. His lecturing was an important contribution to the growing legend of Mark Twain, the man, for it brought his name before the public more than the name of any other author. In addition to his writing and lecturing abilities, he had a number of other accomplishments. He was a moving singer, particularly of a Negro spirituals he loved. He could play the guitar well and the piano better than average. But the outstanding thing about him, everyone who knew him agreed, was the quality of his speaking voice, which was beautiful, expressive, and capable of infinite varieties of expression. By the time of he was 40, his name was a household word. People knew who Mark Twain was, and in every club and parlor over the country, his latest observations and jokes were passed along. His restless temperament, the restless spirit of the West, never left him. He could not stay in one place long, not even a place where he had made himself famous. He left America for a trip to Europe and the Holy Land, saying that he wanted to suggest to the reader how he would be likely to see Europe and the East if he looked at them with his own eyes instead of the eyes of those who traveled before him. In that statement stands Mark Twain's code. He wanted to look with fresh eyes. He would not accept the evaluation of the past. But there was another American spirit in the trip of the Quaker City. The purpose of the trip was to provide the passengers with a culture as well as entertainment. America was beginning to feel its lack of historic past. It was beginning to be embarrassed by the raw newness of the nation. Now that the material wealth of the country had provided the means to travel, the middle classes were beginning to want to see Europe for themselves. Formerly, only the wealthy could afford to go abroad. In Mark Twain's day, many families were enjoying the privileges and pleasures once reserved for the rich. Many of these people had little or no cultural background. They had not been well educated. They had made their money recently, but they felt themselves as good or better than their old established rich Eastern neighbors. Now they were going to see Europe for themselves. To them, Europe was a kind of glass showcase full of wonders of the past to be wooed and ached over. They thought of Europe as quaint, while they admired the works of art, the cathedrals, the museum, and the palaces and castles. They felt too that culture was not an excuse for poor plumbing and old houses. Mark's book tells of their attitude, which to some extent he shared, their horror at the inequality among people, their scorn at the privileges of the nobility, their disgust at the tyranny of the church. To Mark and to many others, much of Europe was not only a showcase of old master, it was also a showcase of poverty, ignorance, exploitation, corruption, and conservatism, and he did not hesitate to say so. He could not tolerate the stuffed shirts, real Westerner that he was, and he hated the terrible poverty he saw. He felt that all men deserve a decent place to live, decent clothes, and adequate food. But he did not shut his eyes to shortcomings of his fellow travelers. He knew they often behaved badly and he despised their habit of cutting their initials on famous relics, of carting of souvenirs, and of talking in loud voices about the relative merits of Europe and America. To most of the pilgrims, there was absolutely no comparison at all. America was the biggest, best place in the world. He came back to America and married for a time. It seemed he would settle down. He built a beautiful, if strange, home in Hartford, but he learned to know all the literary lights in Boston and New York. He made a special friend of William Dean Howells, a famous critic and novelist. Howells, a cultivated Easterner, was enormously respected and he had a great deal of influence on Mark Twain. But even Howells' restraining influence could not stem the spectacular in Mark Twain. Howell's restraining influence could not stem the spectacular in Mark Twain. To the end, he was Westerner, seeing a new fortune around the corner. Mark Twain had no more business going into the publishing field than he did investing in typesetting machine. He had no head for business and he would not admit his limitations. Of course, he could sell books. Of course, he could get a machine that would do away with setting type by hand. But he forgot that you cannot run a publishing house on the theory that you will put out one bestseller after another. Publishing houses must have books that sell reasonably well year after year. They cannot depend on a few spectacular success. Typesetting machines must be workable at a moderate cost. It doesn't make any difference how marvelous a machine is. It must work more than it breaks down. It must be reasonable to run. Otherwise, it is an oddity, nothing more. But Mark Twain was always the man from the West who would stake his fortune on a lucky return of the wheel on a sudden strike in silver. In the early 1880s, he tried to patent a steam generator which cost him a fortune. Then he invested $32,000 in a steam pulley. Next, he invested in watch company, an insurance company, a chocolate process, and lost somewhere near $50,000. He had a chance to invest in the telephone but turned that down, saying that he did not want anything more to do with wildcat speculation. How little he knew himself. The wildcat speculation in the typesetting machine was to eat up his fortune and to set him to wandering again. It is said he invested $300,000 in Peggy's typesetting machine. In his later life, he lived in London, Vienna, Paris, Berlin, Italy, Switzerland, and Sweden, as well as in the United States. Even in Europe, his personality attracted visitors, and the family would no sooner settle down than a procession of guests would be at the door, anxious to partake of that famous talk that some said was more representative of his genius than his writing was. Once his daughter Jean remarked, "Why, Papa, if it keeps on like this, pretty soon there won't be anybody for you to get acquainted with but God." Nevertheless, all the adulation never turned his head. He retained his humility, his knack of holding on to the common touch. He still judged men by what they were, not by their rank or position or money. He served at the age of 70 as pallbearer for his coachman, saying that the man was his ideal of the perfect gentleman. He had a few eccentricities, like all unusual personalities. In later years, these quirks became more pronounced. His love of billiards amounted to an obsession. He said that he thought he walked at least 10 miles a day around a billiard table. Wow! And it was not unusual for him to play all night. When the urge struck him, he had a hatred for noises, and any small consistent noise, the ticking of a clock, the rattling of paper, someone whistling tunelessly, could drive him to distraction. He was a slowly dresser and he was a showy dresser, and he became a conspicuous actor when he felt the center of attention was drifting away from him. In other words, he did not disdain adulation. Legends never do. In other words, he did not disdain adulation. Legends never do. It has been said that his personality was more striking in the history of American literature than his writing. There is certainly no doubt that his vitality and his vivid language made him memorable not only in his own time but remained after death to cast a spell over future generations.